with you this morning. I enjoy coming up here, and it's been a couple years since I've had the opportunity to do that, but I'm just grateful for this opportunity to be here. Thankful for somebody taking a vacation to Hawaii, maybe. Don't you just love the stories of Jesus? Don't you love them? Oh, you know, I love to hear them. I love to read them. I love to meditate on them. And I love to tell those stories to other people. I stop and I think of some of those old dear hymns to me. I love to tell the stories. Tell me the old story, and tell me the story of Jesus. And when I sing that, I think, oh yeah, those stories of Jesus. The Apostle John, as he was writing his gospel, towards the end of his gospel, he makes this little comment. He said, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. In other words, there were many, many more stories that he could have told. But he goes on to say, but these stories were written that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that by believing in him, we would have life in his name. I like that. The bottom line of those stories about Jesus is we might come to know who he is and what he's done for us, and that we might put our faith in him, and by having that faith in him, we would have eternal life. Bottom line. This morning I do want to share one of the stories of Jesus with you, and it's found in Luke, the 2nd chapter. The story starts in Luke 2:41, actually, is where it's going to start. Now, this is the only story that we have of all the stories that we have of Jesus. This is the only story of Jesus during those growing up years. We have stories of him as an infant. Don't get me wrong. We have the story of Jesus being born. And then we have a quick reference to him being circumcised when he was 8 days old. We have another quick story of him being presented at the temple when he was 40 days old. Then we have that story of Jesus being carried off to Egypt by his parents, and because of the threat from Herod. And then we have the story of his parents carrying him back to Nazareth after that threat was gone. But in all of these stories, Jesus is passive. They're important stories, don't get me wrong. They identify who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. They identify how he was conceived. They tell us many things. He's worthy of worship. We can see these things in the stories. But in all of those stories, he's passive. He's silent. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't say anything. And then in this one story, the only story we have between Jesus' infancy and him coming back on the scene at 30 years old, this story here, only story we have. And in this story, we actually have the first recorded words of Jesus. Now, from my perspective, if they're the first recorded words, they must be important. What he had to say. And again, after these words, he goes silent for another 18 years and we don't have anything else recorded about him until he is 30 years old and beginning his ministry. So let's go ahead and take a look at the story. Again, Luke, the 2nd chapter, starting in verse 41. And I want to give you a little bit of background to this story to begin with. God had delivered the nation of Israel out of the hands of bondage in Egypt. They had been in Egypt for over 400 years. And he did that through a powerful, just a demonstration of his power and his might, what we call the Passover. On that particular night, the death angel passed over and took the lives of all the firstborn of the Egyptians. But for those of the nation of Israel, if they had the blood on that doorpost, the death angel passed over them. And so that none of the children of Israel died on that evening. Well, as the nation was getting ready to leave, they had to leave in haste. And so it was like God just sort of took them out of Egypt immediately, and the whole thing with leaven, which we don't deal with too much in our in our day, they said, get out of town, have nothing with leaven in it, and that they're doing their Exodus. Well, to commemorate this whole thing, God gave Israel the celebration of the Passover, which was one day, and then that was immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was another week on top of it. So altogether, it's an 8-day celebration. And all of the Jews were supposed to celebrate this annually in Jerusalem. Now, Joseph, him being a righteous man and doing what God had commanded him, each year, Mary and Joseph, they went to Jerusalem as God had commanded them. But it's a little bit different than taking a trip to, let's say, Denver, where we jump in our cars and just sort of go on our own way. When Mary and Joseph would have made this journey, they would have been a part of a big entourage of people leaving from Nazareth, making this journey down to Jerusalem. Matter of fact, not only from Nazareth, but whole communities from all around this northern Galilee area would travel and form these caravans and just sort of make their way down to Jerusalem. And for Mary and Joseph, coming from Nazareth, it was a 5-day journey on foot. Then an 8-day celebration in Jerusalem, and then a 5-day journey back home. And I think the way God had sort of put it together, the journey was an important part of the celebration as a whole. If you could imagine these great caravans getting together, Mary and Joseph, and not only their immediate family, but the extended family from Nazareth, and friends and neighbors, all getting on the road together and beginning this 5-day journey. And one of the first things that would have happened, well, they would have got a break from the day-to-day. They're not working in their fields, they're just sort of relaxing, part of their vacation, if you will. And the first thing that would have happened is the women would have gotten together and discussed women things as they made their trip down to Jerusalem. And the guys, I can almost imagine them all with a cup of coffee as they're walking along, trying to resolve all the political problems in the world today, if they're anything like men today, right? Okay, not the coffee, but you can still imagine all of the guys in their group talking about the political situation or whatever else is happening, and just trying to resolve everything as they made their way along the road to Jerusalem. And the kids, no car seats, no seat belts to keep them strapped in behind. They just ran with the group. And so they might have been in a group of kids, and they might have been with some of their relatives, or they might have been some with their neighbors, but they had the freedom to run up and down in this gigantic entourage of people as they made their way to Jerusalem. And so what we can, as we're looking at so far in the story, everything was just kosher. Everything was happening just the way it was supposed to. We see Mary and Joseph being nice and obedient, and we see them teaching Jesus to be the same. Well, on this particular year, Jesus was turning 12 years old, or was 12 years old. And many scholars believe this would have been the year that Jesus would have made that transition from being a child in culture to an adult underneath the law in culture. Later on, that change from child to adult would be called bar mitzvah. But this is getting before the actual beginning of that celebration. But it still would have been the time in which Jesus would have been making that transition. I'm a child in the community. I'm looked upon as a child in the community. That doesn't mean I can do sin, but I'm still a child in the community. And then there would have been that point in which he's assuming the role of an adult. We sometimes call that the age of accountability. I think sometimes in America we've rolled that age of accountability back to 30. But at this point in time, that age of accountability for the Jews to become an adult would have been about this time in Jesus' life. And so, again, a very, very important time in Jesus' life. And like I said, everything seemed to be going very well, just the way it ought to, until they started to go home. You know the story. Those big caravans were forming up again to make their way back home, and Mary and Joseph got in theirs and started on that journey back to Jerusalem, or not to Jerusalem, but back to Nazareth. And they travel all day long. And when they get to where they're going to spend the night on this journey, they start looking around for Jesus and they can't find him. And they quickly look among their relatives and neighbors and they still can't find him. And you can imagine the panic that begins to set in as they, oh no, what happened to Jesus? And so they hurry back to Jerusalem and begin this looking for Jesus in Jerusalem. And on the third day, they finally find him. He's in the temple, talking to the priest in the temple. And I think of Mary, and when Mary and Joseph finally find Jesus, it's Mary who starts the conversation. And she looks at Jesus and says, now, I can't imitate it very well. I should probably get one of you women to do this for me. But you have to imagine, Mary is filled with thankfulness. She's found her son after losing him for 3 days. But she's also a little upset. So on the one hand, she's saying, thank God I found you. And on the other hand, she's saying, I'm so angry with you. So how do we say that? We can't just simply read it. Son, why have you treated your father and I like this? You got to put the emotion into it. Son, why have you treated your father and I like this? We've been searching anxiously for you. Mary throws the first words out there. Now, this story resonates with me because several years ago, my wife and I were youth sponsors up in Gillette, Wyoming, and we took a group of kids. It was early or late summer, early fall, I'm not too sure which it was, but we left Gillette and we went to Casper, Wyoming to go ice skating for the day in that indoor ice skating rink that they have. And we spent the day ice skating, and we had all the plans laid out. When we're all done, we're going to meet here, then we're going to go get some dinner, and then we'll head back to Gillette. It was all planned. And we thought everything was going according to plan. Sure enough, we spent the day skating, all met and went to the restaurant. And while we were eating at the restaurant, somebody said, "Where's Andy?" Not our Andy, our daughter Andy, but a young boy who was in the youth group. He wasn't there. And so one of us jumped in the van real quick and drove back to the ice skating rink. And he was right there where we were supposed to meet. But it was still, when we found him, we could experience that. A little bit of joy, a little bit of thanksgiving, a whole lot of anger, frustration. See, Andy, I don't want to blame this all on Andy. It really was our fault. We were the sponsors. We didn't do the head count. Everybody sound off or anything. We didn't take roll call or anything. We just sort of assumed everybody was going to be at the meeting spot at the right time, and wrong assumption. I'm not trying to blame this on Andy. We're the fault. But you see, I am going to blame it a little bit on Andy. Because Andy was one of those, he wasn't really an evil boy, but he was somewhat of a naughty boy. He probably deserved a lump of coal on Christmas more often than not. That's just the way he was, okay? And he was always goofing off and never paying attention, just sort of doing his own thing, the things that you do to deserve the lump of coal. And because he was doing that, he just paid no attention when we were making all the plans and everything else. Well, my point with all this is twofold. Number one, identify with the story, because I've been there. I don't know if you have or not, but I've been there. But the other side of that is I'm thinking about Jesus. My point is not this, that Jesus was like Andy, deserving a lump of coal as a 12-year-old. Matter of fact, the story is just the opposite. It is not a story of disobedience on Jesus' part, but it's actually a story of obedience on Jesus' part. Let's pick it back up with Mary's words to Jesus as this dialogue begins between Mary and Jesus. Son, why have you treated your father and I this way? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. And here we have Jesus' first words. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I must? And before I go any further, I want to sort of explain the meaning of the word must here. That I must. It's this idea of do something that was absolutely necessary, a sense of duty or obligation, compulsion. It's not just I felt like it, but there is something driving Jesus to do this. So he says, didn't you know that I must be in the... And if you're following along in your Bibles, some of your Bibles are going to read, in my Father's house. And some of your translations are going to read, I need to be in or about my Father's business. And some of your translations are going to read, I must be involved in my Father's affairs. And one translation reads, in the things of my Father. And I'm thinking, why the differences in translation? I mean, there's a lot of difference with Jesus' first words. They're important. And there's a lot of difference. And the reason why there's this difference is what Luke actually recorded. He was writing in the Greek language, and he said, all Jesus actually responded is, I must be in the. And he doesn't say what he actually had to be in. Now, that's good Greek. That's lousy English. Because we need that place defined. And so translators have tried to fill in where Jesus needed to be. And since he was in the temple, his Father's house, hey, didn't you know? And that's where they found him. Didn't you know I needed to be in my Father's house? But the problem is what Jesus, as I said, he just said, I need to be in the, and it's not just the, but it's those. I need to be in those, and I know the is not a word in English, but it's a plural the. Now, normally, when that is translated, and that happens all the time in the Greek language, and that when that comes into English, they just simply put down the things. They provide the word things. And that's the way I want to look at these words of Jesus this morning. And that's why you see the variable, especially with the King James, about my Father's business, or the NLT, if you're reading from that, in my Father's affairs, or in the things of my Father. Because that's what he would have been saying. Didn't you know that as a sense of obligation, as a sense of duty, I must be involved in the things of my Father? And he's using this story to teach his mother a lesson. That sounds strange, a 12-year-old teaching his mother. That happens all the time today, but this time it's a real lesson. That I have another, my Father, and I am under compulsion, I'm under duty, I'm under obligation to be involved in the things of my Father. That's why I was sent, to be involved in those things. And as we look at Jesus' ministry begin to unfold, we see that over and over again. After he's 30 years old and he's starting to do his ministry, listen to some of the statements that Jesus makes. And essentially he's saying the same thing. I've got to be involved in my Father's business, or my Father's affairs, the things of my Father. The first one, he's talking, he says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. In yet another place he says, I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but do the will of him who sent me. In yet a third place he says, the one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. His Father's business, his Father's affairs, the things of his Father, not only included all of the teaching that Jesus did while he was here and the preaching that he did while he was here, and the healing ministry that he did while he was here.